It's been an extremely chaotic 9 days, beginning with the attempted assassination of President Trump in Pennsylvania, followed by the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, and most recently, President Biden's announcement that he would no longer be seeking the Democratic nomination, that he would not be running for reelection. And shortly thereafter, he endorsed his Vice President, Kamala Harris. I'm a huge fan of David Frum's. He writes for The Atlantic. He is a conservative Republican who has been trying to find his way in the midst of Trumpism. I've enjoyed reading your pieces so much in The Atlantic and appreciated your perspective so much. I wanted to talk to you about what has happened and what's to come. But before we even get into that, I'd love for you to explain your political ideology and the transformation that you have experienced in recent years as a conservative.
Well, my political idea, thank you for asking and thank you for the honor of this platform. My politics have changed less than you might think. I got involved in conservative politics as a obnoxiously political teenager in the 1970s. I grew up in a city, Toronto, where I think almost every adult I knew was either themselves or the child of someone who had come to Toronto because of persecution somewhere. People had fled Hungary in 1956, the Czech Republic in 1968. One of my homeroom teachers lived with a man who'd been tortured in Chile. My own family, of course, had barely escaped the Nazi Holocaust. They weren't victims of it. They got out in time. They didn't know it was coming, but it was a close shave, and so many others. So I grew up believing in the importance of democratic power as a way of protecting people. It wasn't enough to stand for the right things. That if you sent justice out into the world unarmed, it would be victimized. It had to be protected. It had to be protected by strength. And that kind of military strength, in turn, depended on a strong economy. So I believed in free enterprise. And it's now half a century later. I still believe in those things. I believe in free trade and free enterprise and a strong America defending democracy all over the world. It's just everyone else has changed their minds.
Let's talk about how Donald Trump impacted your political views.
Yeah.
How did you change as a result of his ascent?
Well, like I spent a lot of time in New York, of course, as a young person. And so we all knew Donald Trump as a joke and a fraudster and a con artist. And the idea of him as president was kind of funny. That he had been involved in the birther slurs against President Obama, which, again, I didn't vote for Obama either time, but I thought the slurs were disgusting. And then he began campaigning with basically a lot of Russian help. And that struck me as dangerous and unacceptable. So I was very strongly against him. And again, I don't think it was the things I was, he was a protectionist. He was against America's leadership role in the world. He was against treating people with equal dignity. I didn't think I was saying anything so very remarkable. I was more amazed by the number of my friends who I thought would be with me, who suddenly were not. Or
why do you think that happened? Why do you think there was a departure among your fellow Republicans, and some went toward Trump and others were repelled by him?
Well, let me take the most dramatic example, and that's the vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, who is an old friend of mine, somebody I believe he may have had, if not his very first, then one of his very first bylines in a website I ran. I published about 8 or 10 of his pieces, maybe more. And he wrote for The Atlantic, where I now work in 2016, and was passionately opposed to Trump, very eloquently and forcefully. And the thing that changed his mind was Trump unexpectedly winning in 2016. And then a lot of people began to refine their calculations. It's a strange thing. Even if you're not actually expecting to get anything out of being close to power, people hate not being close to power. And when power changes, people change.
It was miraculous to see how much people had changed. I recently saw a video and it showed before and after people talking about Donald Trump. It was everyone from Ted Cruz to Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, Lindsey Graham. They could have used J.D. Vance. It was a whole series of people who completely flipped their point of view. Aren't people embarrassed to do such an about face?
Well, some people have a genuine problem, and Mitt Romney, whom you mentioned, is an example of it. So Mitt Romney absolutely had Donald Trump's number from the very beginning. He was one of the last men standing in the Republican world opposing the Trump nomination in 2016. But when Trump did become president, he invited Mitt Romney to consider becoming Secretary of State. And Romney smelled a rat, but former President George W. Bush called Romney and said, "You must do it." And Hillary Clinton, who had run against Donald Trump, called Mitt Romney and said, "You must do it." So when you have George W. Bush and Hillary Clinton both telling you you must do something for the good of the country, I mean, you're going to think about it, right? So Romney went to that famous dinner with Donald Trump where he was photographed looking like a man caught having dinner with Satan. And it's like Trump's faces all lit up in demonic glee, and Romney is looking uncomfortable and embarrassed and ashamed of himself. And why am I here? Is an eloquent picture. But a lot of people were in Romney's situation where they were saying, well, legally, the man is president. The government has to be carried on. I wrote a piece about this for a friend of mine, actually, who was in this situation. I wrote a piece for The Atlantic in January of 2017, Should I Serve in the Trump Administration? And gave a series of ways to think about it. But it ended with this warning. That, look, if you are offered a certain kind, you shouldn't work for the White House, you shouldn't work for the political operation. But if you're offered a job in national security or some other area of urgent national importance, you do need to think about it. But you also need to consider this. You're going to have to be able to say no. And you also need to consider, if Trump thought you would say no, he wouldn't have offered you the job in the first place.
Getting back to J.D. Vance, David, you know him. He wrote for your publication or your website, Frum Forum, and he was very different in 2016. He has undergone this metamorphosis. What do you think of the J.D. Vance who appeared at the Republican National Convention, and how do you think he will shape the Trump administration if, in fact, Trump is reelected?
Well, I need to say, to this day, I have enormous respect for Vance's abilities and intellect. Unlike a lot of people who get into the Trump orbit, he is not a fool. He's not a joker. He's not lazy. He is a very capable person. And a formidable person. Now, he has weaknesses, and we saw them at the convention, which is he's kind of an intellectual. He is an intellectual. He wrote this important book. He loves ideas, and he doesn't, as an intellectual sometimes, he doesn't have a good filter against weird ideas. He says interesting things, and he doesn't have a good filter against saying things that are offensive as well as interesting. And you're going to be barraged with examples of that. So he's going to be a bit of more of a liability in the campaign than the Trump people calculated, because people are just going to find all these interesting things he said, all these dramatic things he said, vivid things he said. But he does seem to have evolved into a real protectionist, hostile to international trade, and he is the most important enemy of supporting Ukraine and of standing with NATO in the United States Senate. I mean, there are people who are like Rand Paul is even more anti-Ukraine, but Rand Paul is not an important figure in the Senate. J.D. Vance really was and will be even more important, and he is implacable on that question.
What about his feelings toward reproductive rights? He has said in the past, and I think he has since softened his views, that he does not believe in abortion, even in the cases of incest or rape.
Yeah. I wonder how stable that position is going to be. Along with his great intellectual gifts has gone a great deal of ethical and intellectual flexibility. And I would not be surprised if his views on abortion questions and reproductive rights questions began to shift a little bit under the pressure of ambition, as his other views have shifted under the pressure of ambition. I don't think a lot of Republican men who signed up for the farthest reaches of the abortion position in the days when Roe v. Wade was there really thought through what it would mean to try to enforce the laws they say they want in a post-Roe v. Wade world. The amount of surveillance it will take, the amount of policing of the lives of women it will take. I don't know. For a long time, it was a check you could write in confidence that nobody would ever cash it. And now the bank is calling the checks, and suddenly people are realizing it means no in vitro. It means you have to be prepared to police that when women of childbearing age travel across state lines. I mean, it means all kinds of extraordinary things. And it was a little glib before, and now people who were glib are going to face some consequences.
You've noted what you've seen as the strange insistence in Vance's RNC speech to point out that, quote, America is not a set of ideas, and that instead the fact that makes us special is that we have a homeland. Why did you think that was worth noting, David?
Well, it struck me as a very un-American thought. Look, the idea, there's nothing special about America being the cherished homeland of the people who live in the United States. Almost every country in the world is the cherished homeland of the people who live. That's not unique. You know, Ukraine right now is the cherished homeland of people who live in Ukraine. They're fighting for it without J.D. Vance's help. It is not remarkable that a country is a cherished homeland. That is not what makes America, quote unquote, special. That is, it has in common with every other land on earth. What makes America different from those other lands is that it also has a set of animating ideas. You know, France has been a monarchy, it's been a republic, it's been an empire, it's been a dictatorship. And when it was a republic, it's had 5 different republics and, you know, constitutions upon constitutions. It doesn't stop being French because the ideas change. But if you, as Donald Trump tried to do in 2021, overthrow the US Constitution, America becomes a very, very different place. That's what is special, quote unquote, special about the United States. I thought there was also something a little unbecoming about a man who's proudly married to a woman whose parents are immigrants, who's proudly raising a family with names, some of them more familiar in the United States, some of them more familiar in his wife's family's home country or home place of origin in India. That's who he is. To suggest that somehow his Kentucky ancestors are more first-class paid-up Americans than his children will be, than his wife is, that struck me as an odd way to talk.
Let me ask you about a piece you recently wrote in The Atlantic about the assassination attempt against President Trump. You talk about his violent language and sort of the climate he has created in terms of his violent rhetoric and his violent or unempathetic attitudes. Can you tell us the thesis of that piece?
Well, we are all, of course, grateful and relieved that the bullet did not take the life of former President Trump. We're all grateful and relieved that he seems to have been lightly wounded, but not in a way that impaired his functioning. A brave man was tragically killed, and that's heartbreaking. As I understand, that man was killed trying to save his children, which is awe-inspiring and also heartbreaking. Other people were hurt, and of course, the gunman is dead. This was a terrible incident, and we're all grateful that the United States did not suffer that act of political violence. But Donald Trump and his supporters want something more than gratitude that his life was spared. They want some kind of exoneration or amnesty for all the times that Donald Trump has welcomed violence against other people. And no one should face violent death. We're grateful that you are spared when you do face violent death, but that doesn't change the kind of person you were. If you were a bad person, we're glad you weren't killed, but you remain the same bad person you always were. Donald Trump mocked when Nancy Pelosi's husband met a home invader who hammered him nearly to death. Donald Trump thought it was a big joke, and his son tweeted out vile aspersions that Paul Pelosi had somehow invited this attack upon himself through some sexual misadventure. When a gang of thugs tried to kidnap the governor of Michigan, and with who knows what murderous intention they had against her, Donald Trump again treated it like a big joke. His own vice president, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, who were attacked on January 6th, and they were faced with kidnapping and maybe worse. Donald Trump again has said he wants to pardon the people who did this and doesn't take it seriously as a crime. He has no sympathy. He often exults in violence against others. And that doesn't in any way excuse violence against him. But it also means he doesn't get an amnesty from our judgment of the kind of person he is by the fact that he mercifully and thankfully escaped death himself.
Let's turn to President Biden and the announcement that he is stepping down. What was your reaction?
I was certainly surprised. I was completely agnostic as to what would happen. I don't have great sources inside the Biden White House. I had no window into that decision making. And I had a lot of sympathy for this man who was suffering the waning of his considerable powers. He's president of the United States. And he got the job late. He's been seeking the job all his life. He ran in 1988. He ran in 2008. He wanted to run in 2016. He finally runs at the end of his career in 2020. He wins. He'd like to run for a second term, but he just time is not favorable to him. It's kind of a sad thing. And we're all going to be in this boat, was the last to recognize that time was moving against him in the way that it did. And I wrote something about him, and maybe because I have a personal situation that makes me very aware of the losses that come with time, that I really felt for him. But look, he's an employee. If he can't do the work, the employer's entitled to say, look, we're going to have a compassionate exit strategy for you, Joe. But in the end, you work for us and you're not able to do the job. Time to move on to the next phase of your life.
Do you think the focus will shift from Biden's age to now Donald Trump's age, given his performance at the convention and his 90-minute, often rambling acceptance speech?
I was not the first to point this out, that Trump just gave in 2024 the longest nomination acceptance speech ever given. The second longest was given by Donald Trump in 2016, and the third longest was given by Donald Trump in 2020. I used to write speeches for George W. Bush, and his review was, I hate sitting there at someone else's speech for more than 24 minutes, so I don't want anyone to have to sit through one of my speeches for more than 24 minutes. Okay, maybe if it's the State of the Union, we go to 50. But other than that, 24 minutes is as much as I could take. I get bored, he would say. I get bored of myself after 24 minutes. So 24 minutes seems like a good number. I think there will be attention to Donald Trump's many, many psychic issues, his obvious verbal decline. But he's going to try to turn the tables on his opponents by making the race about a psychosexual attack on his opponent, Vice President Harris. And that's going to be a race of breathtaking ugliness, I expect.
What do you mean by that, psychosexual?
So, look, we like to believe that elections are about the issues, right? We like to believe that we're rational decision makers, that we're not influenced, but we're just not. We're primates who wear pants. We're choosing the leader of the pack here. And we're going to follow the leader around the plains of Africa looking for small birds to eat. And that's deep in our need. And we make judgments that are not very rational by modern standards. The taller candidate tends to win. The more aggressive candidate tends to win, but not too aggressive. And women are going to face special challenges in presidential politics. There's some data that women face actually in certain local races. It's better to be a woman because people ascribe, if you're running for school board, it's an advantage to be a woman. People ascribe more care for children to women. But at the top job, it's going to be more difficult. And there is, because she is childless, because she had a later life marriage, because she had, she comes from the Bay Area, which is associated in Republican minds with dirt and depravity. There are going to be charges leveled against her, and it's already starting. And you won't hear them on Fox, and you won't hear them from the pro-Trump talkers on CNN, but they're going to be playing off them in ways that their audience knows is true. And the challenge is going to be that we're not saying that no woman should ever be president, but not a woman with the sordid, squalid past of the vice president. And don't ask us for details because we're too polite to say so. But if you go to Breitbart.com, you can read all about it.
How do you think she navigates this perception that she's too progressive?
She has an opportunity to do some unprogressive things. She was a prosecutor. She can remind people of that. And
he made some pretty tough decisions as Attorney General.
Yeah, you do it because look, at any given point, only about 2/3 of Americans can even name the vice president. They don't know very much about her, so she has a lot of opportunity to reinvent herself. So you do it through your speeches and your appearances. Stress. Criminals belong in prison. There shouldn't be tent encampments in the middle of American cities. The border has to be enforced. Obviously taxes can't be 100%. The engine of the economy is private enterprise, and we respect the people who make it go. And she needs to travel to Ukraine and to Israel and show ourselves on the front lines of democracies and battle. Make it clear that a woman can be a war leader, as Margaret Thatcher and Indira Gandhi and Golda Meir were war leaders. That there are things you can do because you are the very thing that Donald Trump is going to use against her, which is Americans don't know that much about her, is also her potential assets. Americans don't know that much about her.
What about the border? A lot of people have criticized her because the Biden administration charged her with understanding, not fixing the border, which is often reported, but understanding the root causes of the immigration crisis. People say she really didn't do a good job on that. What do you think her defense will be or should be? And do you think the criticism is fair?
Well, she can't say what I'm about to say, which is I totally blame the Biden administration for giving her that job. That was unreasonable and unfair. The way you use, if you're the oldest president ever elected, you really have an obligation to prepare your vice president for office, not just in being ready to do the work, but in getting the public to accept this person. So you need to give this vice president portfolios where the vice president can succeed with the powers of the vice presidency. You can't give the vice president one of the 2 or 3 most important issues the administration faces, because the vice president doesn't have the power to get anything done. You can't give the vice president the border, the hottest button issue of post-COVID America. It's not going to work. That has to be the president's portfolio. What you should give the vice president is bringing the electrical grid into the 21st century. You should give the president making sure the vice president, thank you. You give the vice president making sure that we have sufficient capacity to do arms production, make enough shells and things like that if we ever need them. Give her something that's important, but that's not hot button. And where when she talks to the stakeholders, they don't think they're going to be able to appeal this issue to the president because they know it's not a presidential issue. So Biden set her up for failure. And that was not just her, that was not her problem. That was his decision. And I think a lot of it came because he wouldn't face the numbers about his age. I think there was a lot of ambivalence there about how to use her. And so I don't think there's any possibility that she could have been successful on that issue as vice president, and it should never have been assigned to her.
In closing, I know that you believe that Donald Trump is beatable, but I'm curious how you're feeling now about the election. Are you a man without a candidate, or are you a never Trumper? Do you believe that Kamala Harris is qualified if in fact she gets the nomination? How are you feeling about it all?
Look, I'm hoping to have life and health enough to go back to voting for Republican candidates at some point in the future on issues of taxes and business regulation and trade and national defense. But we've been living through a democratic emergency for a decade. I think in some ways it did start with the rise of the Tea Party, where there's a real challenge to whether or not the United States can be governed the way it has been governed. And in that, the first priority, my first loyalty is to the Constitution. And so I'll happily vote for whoever is running against Donald Trump, providing they meet the qualifications of being over 35 and a citizen of the United States and not Donald Trump. That I'll vote for that person with enthusiasm. I'll be there early. And then I hope we pass through this phase and we go back to talking about the things that we should be talking about. And there, I'm not going to be with Kamala Harris at all. But that's okay. That's what politics is for.
So are you saying that you might vote for Kamala Harris?
If she's the nominee against Donald Trump and she's a U.S. citizen over the age of 35, I will vote for her. Of course, easy. I voted for Joe Biden. I voted for Hillary Clinton. Those are all those are not enjoyable votes, but they were easy votes. And what I hope is that if she is the Democratic nominee, that she prevails, beats Trump, sends him and his style of politics off to obscurity, and that in 2028, she and someone like Brian Kemp, governor of Georgia, start having real meaningful arguments about the size and cost of the government, how we pay for retirement programs, how we make sure that the private sector drives investment, all the things that I think politics that is central to my politics.
And finally, any insight into who she, if she gets a nomination, might select as her vice presidential running mate?
I think the people I'm mo I mean, there's a lot of like state by state analysis. There's a lot of gamesmanship. I don't think those things really work. I think you need to the most important qualification in a vice president is the person be someone who is ready to be president instantly. And so I think she needs to look at governors, and I'd like to see her looking at one of the more conservative leaning governors like Roy Cooper of North Carolina or Andy Beshear of Kentucky, someone who will send a message to the country that this is not some wacko progressive outfit, that you're dealing here with the stable center of American politics. And the job here is to govern, not to make positions.
David Frum, it's great to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for your really thought-provoking and fascinating writing in The Atlantic.
Thank you. And I am very grateful to be here. Thank you.